In 1969, Capitol Records took a risk on a Christian hippie who had previously been a songwriter for the one-hit wonder band People, and after that did some work writing in musicals. I know, sounds like a sure bet, right? His name was Larry Norman, and after leaving People, he spent time as a street minister in Hollywood, using all of his royalties from his one-hit wonder band to start a halfway house and to buy food and clothes for people. Norman had been a success for Capitol Records as a part of People, so they decided to give him a chance, and they released his first solo album entitled Upon This Rock. It is now considered to be the very first Christian rock album, but it was denounced by various television evangelists, and it was deemed such a flop by Capitol Records that they dropped him from their label entirely. However, the album was quietly gaining a large following in the emerging countercultural movement that eventually became known as the Jesus movement. Despite releasing the first album in what would become the huge Christian music industry, Larry Norman was never a big fan of what happened with that industry after his album. Because in Norman's songs, he wrote about politics, the passive commercialism of wartime journalists, and religious hypocrisy in ways that were much more confrontational than the artists who would follow him. In the 1980s, as the Christian music industry was picking up steam, Norman complained how so much of it was, quote, sloppy thinking, dishonest metaphors, and bad poetry. Apparently not one to mince his words. Norman also spoke out against Christian musicians who refused to play in secular arenas. He criticized the roles of copyrights and licensing in building a mountain of money and wealth instead of speaking truth through music. One of Norman's best known songs from that first album back in 1969 was the song, I Wish We'd All Been Ready. The song was brought back to prominence in the mid-90s when the Christian rock group DC Talk covered it. The song describes an apocalyptic world in the end times after the Christians were raptured to heaven and the rest of the world is left with violence and poverty. And each verse ends with a potent line, the sun has come and you've been left behind. Now, as much as I might quibble with the theology and scriptural basis behind the idea of the rapture, as mentioned not too long ago in a sermon, the word rapture is not found in Revelation, or the idea that God would rescue the Christians while leaving the rest of the world to a cycle of increasing war, violence, and poverty, I don't think that's really in the Bible either. That's not the point of the sermon. Because the heartbeat of the song, the heartbeat is the eponymous line, I wish we'd all been ready. And while I think we can safely reject the crass commercialism and violence of what has become of so much end times theology in parts of Christianity, no matter what you think of the end times, that question from Larry Norman's song remains important. And it hangs in the air of today's gospel reading from Matthew 25. You can almost hear the foolish bridesmaids singing it. I wish we'd all been ready. Today's reading is actually a part of the second Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. See, you thought there was just one. No. Most of us are familiar with the first one that begins in Matthew 5 as Jesus teaches the crowds about the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure at heart, for they will see God, and then the deeper meaning of the law. You have heard that it was said, but I tell you. The second sermon is also preached on a mountain, but is preached on the Mount of Olives across from Jerusalem and the temple. Not preached to the crowds like the first sermon, the second sermon is one Jesus preached only to his disciples. And instead of talking how we should live as a part of the kingdom he's ushering in, Jesus talks in this second sermon about the end of the age. And he describes wars and persecutions, sacrilege and false messiahs, the heavens and the earth shaken before the Son of Man comes in glory. He says, no one knows when this day will come. And then after 40 verses of apocalyptic language, Jesus begins describing how his disciples should live while they wait for his return. Instead of using short aphorisms like in the first Sermon on the Mount about love or turning the other cheek or going the extra mile, in this sermon, Jesus tells 4 substantial stories, parables, to flesh out how we should live until the end of age comes. And our gospel reading appointed for today is the second of those parables. In the story, Jesus offers a context that would have been familiar to his audience, even if it is far from our own customs and traditions surrounding weddings. In Jesus' time, the guests would assemble at the home of the bride, whose parents would entertain the guests until the bridegroom approached. When he arrived, the guests, including the bridesmaids, would light their torches and go out to greet him, then forming a festive procession to the groom's house. At the groom's house, his parents were waiting for the wedding ceremony itself and the banquet and celebrations that would follow and actually continue for several days. And they must have been different than our wedding receptions, because a wedding reception that lasts for several days sounds like hell to me and not heaven. In our parable, we are told that among the bridesmaids, 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. All 10 took lamps to the party, but 5 of them, the wise ones, apparently had a sense of this bridegroom and that punctuality was not one of his virtues. So they brought some extra flasks of oil to be prepared for a bit of a wait. And when the bridegroom was delayed, all 10 grew drowsy and slept. Apparently the entertainment planned by the bride's parents was woefully inadequate. Then at midnight there was a shout that the bridegroom was finally arriving. The bridesmaids arose, they trimmed their lamps, but the foolish ones were now all out of oil. They tried to get the wise to share with them, but there would not be enough. So the foolish went off to the market to try to find someone to sell them oil past midnight. And as a result, they missed the whole procession. And when they finally arrived at the party, the doors were shut. They were not allowed in. You can almost hear them sing Norman's song, "I wish we'd all been ready." And Jesus ends telling his disciples, "Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The church gives us this reading at this point in the year because we are nearing the end of that long, green, ordinary time season. And Advent is hastening toward us faster than you could put Christmas music on in a grocery store in November. We are invited to remember that Jesus will return and to ask what it means to live in preparation for Christ's return. Are you ready? The text for today asks us. Or, perhaps more accurately, are you ready to wait? After all, that seems to be the key question in the text. Though Jesus tells us to keep awake, both the wise and the foolish fell asleep. So the point cannot literally be to stay awake and alert. Keeping awake can't mean purifying the church, getting rid of all of those who are wrong, because both the wise and the foolish are part of the gathering. It's not our job to sort them out as much as we might like to. The only difference in the story seems to be that the wise are prepared for the wait and therefore bring extra oil with them. So really today's text is not really about whether you are ready for Christ's return, but whether you are ready to wait for Christ's return. Because the wise are prepared for the delay. They are prepared to wait. And so, when their faith in the arrival of the bridegroom might be tested by his delay, they have resources to sustain them. And there is such wisdom in that I think all of us might long for at times. After all, which of us has not looked at the news or the church or our own lives and thought, "Oh, come quickly, Lord Christ." As one scholar acknowledges, freedom, justice, and compassion seem fragile in the face of so much oppression, injustice, violence, and torture. Even now, as we stand at the beginning of the third millennium of waiting, how one waits faithfully is an even more acute question. Or, to follow the analogy of today's parable, perhaps we should consider, while we wait, how it is that we can keep our lamps bright. After all, that's an image Jesus uses elsewhere in Matthew, right? Earlier in that first sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus began by telling the crowds, "Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." And then, interestingly enough, that same phrase the foolish bridesmaids use when they bang on the doors in today's reading, "Lord, Lord, open to us," is a phrase Jesus uses at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, when he says to the crowds, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven." So in many ways, we are where we've been for these past several Sundays in Matthew, as Jesus reminds us that simply being religious is not enough, or saying that he's Lord is not enough, if you're not also doing the works of the kingdom. If you are not living out the teachings of Christ in your own life. We must seek to keep enough oil on hand to light our lamp with God's love in this dark world. And we keep our oil full by all kinds of works of the kingdom. By gathering together for worship, for instance. By caring for one another. By being a family to one another. Absolutely. But worship in church is not enough. As Amos reminded us in the first reading for today, where God rejected a worship that was only focused on what happens in these walls, paying no attention to the world around it, insisting in Amos's words, "I reject your worship, but let righteousness roll down like waters, and justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." You see, this is why the wise cannot simply share their oil as we kind of expect them to. It seems rude to say no. But you see, you cannot share your own spiritual growth with those who have not sought to deepen their lives. That's not how spiritual growth works. And when other people refuse to work for justice and righteousness, they can't borrow the work you've done. Or when you stand idly by while others are out there doing the work of the kingdom to bring justice, you can't kind of be like, "Hey, counts for me too," as you sit on the sidelines, unwilling to stand up and speak. All people must be a part of this work of building up the reserves of the oil of justice, love, and compassion, so that the lamp of God's love will never go out in our lives, or in the church, or in this world. As another scholar says, the point is living expectantly and hopefully. Christian hope rests on the trust that the God who created this world will continue to love the world with gentle providence. Will continue the process of creation until that project is complete. And will continue to redeem and save the world by coming into it with love and grace in Jesus Christ. And you and I must keep the world lit with the lamp of that love, with the lamp of God's justice, while we wait. Amen. Come quickly, Lord Christ, please. But until you do, we will seek to keep our oil full and our lamps bright with the message of your loving redemption. Amen.